I sat in that mahogany-paneled law office watching my sister Carla smirk as the attorney shuffled through our late father's will. Carla whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Well, at least the family mistake finally gets to see what real success looks like." My hands trembled as I stared at the stack of legal documents. 23 years of being called worthless, of watching Carla get everything while I scraped by as a struggling teacher. But today, something in the lawyer's expression suggested this reading wouldn't go as Carla expected. Growing up in our suburban Cleveland home, I always knew I was the overlooked daughter while Carla sparkled like polished silver in our father's eyes. Every family dinner became a showcase for her achievements, while my accomplishments disappeared into background noise. When Carla graduated summa cum laude from Northwestern with her business degree, Dad threw a celebration party with 50 guests and champagne toasts. When I earned my education degree from Kent State with honors, he handed me a congratulations card at breakfast and changed the subject to Carla's new internship at a Fortune 500 company. The pattern continued relentlessly through our 20s. Carla climbed the corporate ladder at Lightning Marketing Solutions, earning 6 figures before she turned 25. Meanwhile, I chose to teach 3rd grade at Lincoln Elementary School, earning $38,000 annually and living in a cramped 700-square-foot apartment where the radiator clanged all winter and the air conditioning wheezed through muggy Ohio summers. Dad's favoritism wasn't subtle. For Carla's college graduation, he surprised her with a brand new cherry red BMW convertible, complete with leather seats and a premium sound system. For my graduation, he gave me a used copy of Teaching Strategies for Elementary Education that still had someone else's highlighting and coffee stains on the pages. When Carla announced her engagement to Derek Wellington, a successful investment banker, she met at a charity gala. Dad immediately offered to pay for their entire wedding. They had a lavish ceremony at the Ritz-Carlton with 300 guests, an 8-piece orchestra, and flowers flown in from Ecuador. When I fell in love with Marcus, a kind social worker who shared my passion for helping children, we planned a small ceremony in the local park pavilion. Dad claimed he was tight on funds that month and gave us $500, suggesting we keep things modest and practical. We ended up eloping at the courthouse with 2 witnesses we barely knew celebrating afterward with pizza from Tony's Corner Shop. The real estate empire Dad built from nothing became Carla's assumed inheritance from the moment she could walk. Thompson Construction and Development had grown from Dad's one-man handyman service into a company that developed shopping centers and residential complexes throughout northeastern Ohio. Carla joined the company after college, immediately taking the title of Vice President of Marketing, while I struggled to afford basic classroom supplies for my students. Every family gathering reinforced the hierarchy. Carla would arrive in designer clothes talking about her latest business coup or the vacation home she and Derek were considering in the Hamptons. I'd show up in bargain store dresses, sharing stories about helping struggling readers or organizing school fundraisers that Dad dismissed as nice little hobbies. Carla's children, 8-year-old Madison and 6-year-old Tyler, attended private Montessori school and took violin lessons. My students came from families where a free lunch program meant the difference between eating and going hungry. The dynamic established Carla as the golden heir apparent, while I remained the family disappointment who chose service over success. Dad never missed an opportunity to mention Carla's achievements to neighbors, church members, or business associates. He'd introduce her as my daughter, the marketing executive, while introducing me simply as my other daughter, April. But something shifted dramatically 3 months before Dad's death. He'd suffered a major heart attack that required emergency surgery and a 3-week hospital stay. The gravity of his mortality seemed to crack open something he'd kept buried for decades. That's when the lawyer's expression suddenly changed, and I realized this will reading was about to shatter every assumption my family had held for 23 years. The attorney cleared his throat and announced that Robert Thompson had indeed changed his will just 3 months prior, immediately following his hospital discharge. Carla's confident smirk began to falter as she processed the timing, her manicured fingers gripping the armrest of her chair with increasing tension. The lawyer's office felt charged with electricity as attorney William Fitzgerald spread the estate documents across his massive oak desk. Behind him, law books lined floor-to-ceiling shelves, their leather spines creating a backdrop that seemed to mock the family drama unfolding before them. Carla's perfectly styled blonde hair caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through tall windows, but her usual composure was beginning to crack. Before we proceed with the reading, Attorney Fitzgerald announced, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, "I need to address some irregularities that came to light during the estate's probate process. My father's real estate holdings were more extensive than I'd ever imagined. Beyond the family mansion on Shaker Heights Boulevard worth $2.7 million, according to the latest appraisal, Dad owned 3 rental properties in University Heights that generated substantial monthly income. His investment portfolio included municipal bonds, blue-chip stocks, and a money market account that had grown to impressive proportions over his 40-year career. Thompson Construction and Development was valued at over $1.2 million with ongoing contracts that would generate income for years to come." "What irregularities?" Carla demanded, her voice sharper than usual. Derek shifted uncomfortably beside her, loosening his silk tie and glancing nervously around the room. Attorney Fitzgerald pulled out a thick folder marked "Estate Fraud Investigation." My stomach dropped as I wondered what secrets were about to surface. "Mrs. Wellington," he addressed Carla formally, "were you aware that someone has been showing the Shaker Heights property to potential buyers over the past 6 weeks?" Carla's face drained of color, but she recovered quickly with practiced corporate smoothness. "I have no idea what you're talking about. Perhaps the real estate agent made some mistake." "There was no authorized real estate agent involved," the lawyer replied coolly. "However, we have documentation showing that you contacted Meridian Development Corporation about selling the property for demolition. They were planning to construct a strip mall on the site." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. While Dad was barely cold in his grave, Carla had already been scheming to destroy our childhood home for profit. Every memory embedded in those walls, Christmas mornings by the fireplace, birthday parties in the backyard, quiet evenings when Mom would read to me in the sunroom, meant nothing compared to Carla's greed. Derek's nervous fidgeting became more pronounced as Attorney Fitzgerald continued his investigation summary. "Furthermore, Mr. Wellington, our records show you've been in contact with several creditors regarding substantial gambling debts. Were you counting on your wife's expected inheritance to resolve these financial obligations? That's completely out of line." Derek stammered, but sweat beaded on his forehead despite the air-conditioned office. "My financial situation has nothing to do with this will reading." Aunt Helen, Dad's 72-year-old sister, spoke up from her chair near the window. "Actually, Derek, it has everything to do with it. I heard you on the phone outside the funeral home telling someone you'd have the money within a week because the old man finally kicked the bucket." The room fell silent except for the soft tick of the antique clock on Attorney Fitzgerald's bookshelf. Carla's mask of superiority finally slipped, completely revealing the calculating predator underneath. "You people are all jealous because Dad always knew I was the successful one. April's been living like a pauper her whole life, and now you want to pretend she deserves something she never earned." "Speaking of earning," the lawyer interjected, "we need to discuss some financial discrepancies discovered during our audit of your father's accounts." He produced bank statements highlighted in yellow marker. 3 months ago, $20,000 was withdrawn from Robert Thompson's checking account using a power of attorney document. The withdrawal occurred while your father was hospitalized and unconscious following his heart surgery. My hands clenched in my lap as the magnitude of Carla's betrayal became clear. While Dad fought for his life in the ICU, she'd been stealing money to fund her European vacation. I remembered her Instagram posts from Paris and Rome, captioned with phrases like, "living my best life," and "sometimes you just need to treat yourself." Every museum selfie and restaurant photo had been paid for with stolen money. "That's impossible." Carla protested, but her voice lacked conviction. Dad gave me that money for business expenses. Attorney Fitzgerald opened another folder and pulled out photocopied documents. The power of attorney form was notarized on February 14th, 2 days after your father's heart attack. However, the notary has confirmed that Robert Thompson was never present for this signing. In fact, he was sedated in intensive care that entire week. The forgery accusation hung in the air like poison gas. I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and saw a stranger wearing Carla's face. This woman who'd tormented me for decades, who'd convinced our family that I was worthless while she was wonderful, had been stealing from our dying father. You forged his signature. I whispered the words, escaping before I could stop them. Carla whirled to face me, her eyes blazing with fury. Don't you dare act all innocent, April. You were the one hanging around his hospital bed, like some vulture probably whispering poison in his ear when he was too weak to think clearly. But Attorney Fitzgerald wasn't finished with his revelations. He reached into his briefcase and withdrew what appeared to be a recording device. There's something else we need to discuss before reading the will. Your father made provisions for this exact scenario. The small recording device sat on Attorney Fitzgerald's desk like an unexploded bomb, its silver surface reflecting the overhead lights. Carla stared at it with growing alarm while Derek's knee bounced nervously under the mahogany table. Uncle Paul Dad's younger brother, who'd driven down from Akron for the reading, adjusted his glasses and leaned forward with interest. Cousin Jessica Paul's daughter, who worked as a nurse in Cleveland, sat quietly beside him, her expression sympathetic as she watched the drama unfold. Before we proceed, Carla announced, standing abruptly and smoothing her black Chanel suit, I want everyone to understand the reality of this situation. Dad built his business from nothing, and I've been working alongside him for 8 years. I understand real estate development, construction contracts, and property management. April has spent her career finger painting with children and reading picture books. She gestured dismissively in my direction, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the light. I don't say this to be cruel, but we all know Dad intended for me to continue his legacy. I've already been in contact with our business partners about expansion opportunities. The Meridian Development project alone would generate enough profit to fund 3 new construction ventures. Derek nodded enthusiastically, desperate to support his wife's claims. Carla has MBA-level expertise in strategic planning. She's the logical choice to inherit the business operations. April wouldn't know a profit and loss statement from a grocery list. My cheeks burned with humiliation, but I forced myself to remain silent. 23 years of similar attacks had taught me that defending myself only encouraged more cruelty. Aunt Helen, however, had no such restraint. That's enough, Carla. She snapped her voice, carrying the authority of someone who'd raised 4 children and buried 2 husbands. Your father built that business to provide security for his family, not to fund your shopping addiction and Derek's poker debts. Poker debts. Carla laughed, but the sound was shrill and forced. That's ridiculous. Derek is a successful investment banker. We don't need Dad's money, but we respect his wishes and his business judgment. Attorney Fitzgerald cleared his throat pointedly. Perhaps we should proceed with the actual will reading, rather than speculating about intentions. Carla settled back into her chair with confident expectation, crossing her legs and folding her hands in her lap like a queen awaiting coronation. Derek pulled out his phone, presumably to text someone about their imminent windfall. Cousin Jessica exchanged a meaningful look with Uncle Paul, who shook his head almost imperceptibly. The last will and testament of Robert Joseph Thompson. Attorney Fitzgerald began his voice taking on the formal cadence of legal proceedings. I, Robert Joseph Thompson, being of sound mind and body, do hereby revoke all previous wills and codicils and declare this to be my final will and testament. The lawyer continued through the standard legal language about debts and taxes before reaching the specific bequests. To my brother Paul Thompson and his family, I leave my collection of woodworking tools and the camping equipment stored in my garage with gratitude for 40 years of friendship and support. Uncle Paul smiled sadly, remembering countless weekends when he and Dad had built furniture together or taken fishing trips to Lake Erie. To my sister, Helen Morrison, I leave my mother's china set and the sum of $10,000 in appreciation for her wisdom and kindness throughout my life. Aunt Helen dabbed her eyes with a tissue touched by the acknowledgement of their sibling bond. To my grandson, Tyler Wellington, and granddaughter, Madison Wellington, I establish educational trust funds of $50,000 each to be used exclusively for college expenses. Carla beamed at this provision, clearly viewing it as confirmation of her favored status. Derek actually smiled for the first time since entering the office, probably calculating how they could manipulate the trust funds to their advantage. But then Attorney Fitzgerald's tone shifted, becoming more deliberate and measured. To my daughter, Carla Wellington, I leave the sum of $1. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Carla's mouth fell open in shock, her confident expression evaporating instantly. Derek's face went white as he processed the implications for his gambling debts. $1, Carla stammered. That can't be right. You must have misread something. Attorney Fitzgerald continued reading without acknowledging her interruption. I leave Carla $1 for being my greatest disappointment and for demonstrating that wealth without character leads only to corruption and cruelty. The devastation on Carla's face would have been satisfying if I hadn't been equally stunned by the harsh judgment. Dad had never been one for emotional confrontations or dramatic gestures, but this public humiliation surpassed anything I'd ever witnessed. The remainder of my estate, the lawyer continued, including my residence at 512 Shaker Heights Boulevard, all rental properties, investment accounts, and Thompson Construction and Development. I leave entirely to my daughter, April Thompson, with the hope that she will use these resources to continue helping others and to understand how much her kindness meant to me in my final months. The silence that followed felt dense and suffocating. I couldn't process what I just heard. The mansion, the business, the investments, everything totaled over $4 million. My teacher's salary had trained me to think in terms of hundreds, not millions. Carla exploded out of her chair like a woman possessed. This is fraud. April manipulated him. She poisoned his mind against me when he was dying and vulnerable. But Attorney Fitzgerald wasn't finished. He reached for the recording device and pressed the play button. Your father anticipated there might be questions about his mental state and his decision-making process. He asked me to play this recording if anyone contested his will. Dad's voice filled the room, weak but clear and unmistakably lucid. The sound of his familiar tone brought tears to my eyes and seemed to drain what little color remained in Carla's face. Dad's recorded voice carried the weight of profound disappointment and bone-deep exhaustion. My name is Robert Joseph Thompson. Today is March 15th, and I'm recording this in the office of Attorney William Fitzgerald to explain my final decisions regarding my estate. The room fell into absolute silence, except for the soft whir of the recording device. Even Derek stopped fidgeting, his face pale, as he realized the implications of hearing a dead man's testimony. For 23 years, I favored my daughter Carla because she reminded me of my first wife, Patricia, who left me for another man when Carla was barely walking. I thought success and ambition were the most important qualities a person could have, and I was wrong. Carla's hands trembled as she gripped the edges of her chair. Her usually perfect makeup was beginning to smudge as sweat beaded on her forehead. Dad's voice continued each word deliberate and painful. 3 weeks ago, while I was fighting for my life in the hospital, only one of my daughters visited me every single day. April brought homemade soup read to me from books I pretended not to enjoy, and held my hand when the nurses said my heart might give out completely. My own eyes filled with tears remembering those bedside vigils, the way Dad seemed surprised each time I appeared, as if he couldn't believe someone would care enough to stay. Carla visited me once during my 3-week stay, and only to ask when I planned to update my will. She spent 5 minutes complaining about hospital parking fees before leaving to meet friends for lunch. Derek shot a horrified look at his wife, clearly hearing details about her behavior for the first time. Carla's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, her usual arsenal of excuses completely depleted. But the final betrayal came when I discovered what Carla had been planning behind my back. Attorney Fitzgerald paused the recording to pull out another set of documents from his seemingly endless collection of evidence. Your father hired a private investigator when he became suspicious about certain financial irregularities. He spread out photographs that made my stomach lurch with disgust. The images showed Carla meeting with men in expensive suits outside our family home, gesturing toward the property like a real estate agent conducting a tour. Timestamps revealed the meetings had occurred during Dad's funeral week. She was showing the house to developers while I was being buried. I whispered the enormity of her callousness, hitting me like a physical blow. The recording resumed with Dad's voice growing stronger, fueled by righteous anger. I hired an investigator because I found real estate contracts hidden in Carla's purse during what I thought was a family dinner to discuss my recovery. She wasn't visiting to support her father. She was measuring the property for demolition. Carla suddenly lunged across the table, trying to grab the recording device. "Turn that off. This is slander." He was medicated and confused. Derek caught her wrist, but his motivation seemed more about avoiding additional legal trouble than protecting his wife. "Carla, stop. You're making this worse." Security buzzed into the office. Apparently, Attorney Fitzgerald had pressed a silent alarm when Carla became aggressive. 2 uniformed guards flanked the doorway, while a receptionist peered anxiously from the hallway. "Ma'am, you need to return to your seat," the older security guard instructed firmly but politely. Instead, Carla whirled to face me with venom I'd never seen before, even during our worst childhood conflicts. "You pathetic, manipulative little parasite. You think you're so noble with your stupid teaching job and your boring life, but you're just a leech who couldn't make it in the real world." Uncle Paul stood up, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "Carla, that's enough. You're disrespecting your father's memory." "My father," she shrieked, completely losing the polished facade she'd maintained for decades. "He threw away everything he worked for on some sentimental nonsense about kindness and soup. April doesn't know anything about running a business or managing properties or dealing with contractors." Aunt Helen finally lost her patience completely. "Since we're talking about disrespect, perhaps everyone should know what I witnessed at your father's funeral." The room went dead quiet again. Aunt Helen's voice carried the kind of moral authority that came from 72 years of calling out bad behavior without flinching. "I saw you, Carla, going through your father's wallet while his body was lying in the casket. You took his credit cards and cash while people were paying their respects." Derek's face went ashen. Even he hadn't known about that particular violation. Cousin Jessica, who'd remained silent throughout the proceedings, finally spoke up. "I was there too. I saw her do it and couldn't believe my eyes. I thought maybe she was preserving something sentimental, but now I understand what really happened." The security guards moved closer as Carla's breathing became rapid and shallow signs of someone completely losing control. Derek seemed to shrink into his chair, probably calculating how quickly he could distance himself from his wife's public breakdown. But Attorney Fitzgerald had one more devastating revelation to share. He reached into his briefcase and withdrew a final folder marked "Confidential Investigation Results." "There's something else your father discovered that influenced his decision," he announced, his voice cutting through Carla's heavy breathing. The private investigator uncovered additional information about both Derek and Madison Hartwell. Derek's face went from pale to gray at the mention of the second name. Carla stopped her frantic movements and stared at the lawyer with growing dread. "Who's Madison Hartwell?" I asked, though something in Derek's expression suggested I didn't want to know the answer. Attorney Fitzgerald opened the folder to reveal more photographs, these showing Derek in intimate embraces with a beautiful brunette woman outside expensive hotels and restaurants. Timestamps indicated the encounters had been ongoing for over 6 months. Madison Hartwell is Carla's former best friend and Derek's longtime mistress. According to intercepted communications, they've been planning to leave Cleveland together as soon as Derek gained access to what they assumed would be Carla's inheritance. The revelation struck Carla like a physical blow. She staggered backward, her hand pressed to her chest as if her heart was stopping. The sister who'd tormented me for decades suddenly looked fragile and broken, her entire world crumbling in the span of 30 minutes. Derek didn't even attempt to deny the accusations. He simply sat in stunned silence, knowing his carefully constructed life of lies had been completely exposed. Attorney Fitzgerald adjusted the volume on the recording device as Dad's voice returned, now carrying a tremor of deep emotional pain that cut through the tension in the room like a blade through silk. The hardest part of this whole ordeal, Dad continued his words, measured but heavy with grief, wasn't discovering that my daughter was planning to profit from my death. It wasn't even learning about the stolen money or the forged documents. The hardest part was realizing how completely I'd failed as a father. Carla remained standing by the window, her back turned to the room, shoulders shaking with what might have been rage or devastation. Derek had slumped forward in his chair, his head in his hands, while the photographs of his betrayal lay scattered across the polished table like evidence of multiple crimes. I spent 23 years rewarding cruelty and dismissing kindness because I confused success with character. Dad's recorded voice continued. I watched Carla mock April at family dinners, calling her dreams worthless and her compassion weakness, and I said nothing because I thought ambition mattered more than heart. Aunt Helen wiped tears from her cheeks with a lace handkerchief, nodding slowly as Dad's words confirmed what she'd tried to tell him for years. Uncle Paul reached over and squeezed my hand, his calloused palm warm and reassuring against my cold fingers. The day April came to visit me after my second surgery, she brought a book of poetry our neighbor Mrs. Chen had recommended. April didn't know I was awake when she started reading, but I listened to her voice making those words beautiful, and I remembered her mother doing the same thing when April was small. The memory hit me with surprising force. I'd forgotten about those poetry readings, thinking Dad had been too sedated to notice. But apparently he'd been absorbing every word, every gesture of care I'd thought was going unnoticed. While April was reading to me about hope and healing, I received a phone call from my neighbor, Frank Martinez. He told me he'd seen strange cars in my driveway and people with clipboards walking around my property. When I called Carla to ask about it, she claimed she didn't know anything about visitors, but her voice had that same lying tone she'd used as a child when she broke something and blamed April. The recording captured Dad's breathing becoming more labored as his emotions intensified. Attorney Fitzgerald glanced around the room, ensuring everyone was prepared for whatever revelation was coming next. So I hired Harold Murphy from Murphy Investigations to find out what was really happening with my property and my family. Harold's report destroyed every assumption I'd held about my daughter's characters. A new voice joined Dad's on the recording, presumably Harold Murphy himself reading from his investigative findings with professional detachment. Subject Carla Wellington was observed meeting with representatives from Meridian Development Corporation on 4 separate occasions between February 20th and March 1st. Conversations were recorded using long-range audio equipment with appropriate legal permissions. The investigator's voice became more detailed as he shared specific findings. Subject discussed plans to demolish the family residence immediately upon inheritance, with projected profits of $3.2 million after construction and legal fees. Subject expressed no sentimental attachment to the property and referred to potential family objections as irrelevant emotional nonsense. I felt physically sick hearing Carla dismiss our childhood home so callously. Every room in that house held memories of Mom reading bedtime stories, Dad teaching me to change bicycle tires in the garage, family holiday celebrations that had felt magical despite the underlying tensions. Harold Murphy's recorded voice continued with devastating precision. Subject was also observed removing approximately $800 in cash and 2 credit cards from the deceased's personal effects during funeral services on March 8th. This theft was witnessed by multiple family members, but not reported to authorities. Carla finally turned from the window, her face streaked with mascara and twisted with desperate fury. "This is entrapment. You can't record people without their permission. None of this is admissible in any legitimate court." But Dad's voice returned to the recording with renewed strength, as if anticipating her objections. "I want to be clear about my mental state during these decisions. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, my cardiologist, has confirmed that my medications had no effect on my cognitive abilities. Dr. Michael Foster, my primary care physician for 15 years, conducted mental competency evaluations and found me fully capable of making legal and financial decisions." Attorney Fitzgerald produced medical documents bearing official letterheads and physician signatures. "Both doctors were willing to testify to your father's complete mental clarity during the will revision process." The recording continued with Dad's voice growing more personal and heartbroken. The final piece of evidence that changed everything came from Harold's investigation into Derek Wellington's activities and associations. Derek's head snapped up at the mention of his name, his face cycling through expressions of panic, anger, and resignation. He glanced toward the door as if calculating whether he could escape before hearing the rest of his secrets exposed. Derek has accumulated gambling debts totaling $147,000 through underground poker games and illegal sports betting operations. He's been using Carla's credit cards and joint bank accounts to make partial payments, but the interest and penalties have grown beyond his ability to manage. The dollar amount seemed to physically stagger Derek. He hadn't realized the full extent of his financial destruction had been discovered and documented. More troubling. Dad's voice continued, "Derek has been conducting an affair with Madison Hartwell for 8 months, with plans to leave Cleveland once he gained access to what he assumed would be Carla's inheritance. Text message records show they'd already purchased a house in Austin, Texas, using money Derek stole from his and Carla's joint savings account." Carla's legs seemed to give out completely. She collapsed into the nearest chair, staring at her husband with the expression of someone watching her entire world disintegrate in real time. 23 years of marriage, of building a life together, of believing in their partnership had been revealed as an elaborate fraud designed to steal my father's money. Madison Hartwell. The recording continued, is pregnant with Derek's child. They've been planning their new life together for months, assuming Carla's inheritance would fund their escape from their respective responsibilities in Ohio. The pregnancy revelation broke something fundamental in Carla's spirit. She'd never been able to have children after Madison and Tyler, a source of private grief she'd hidden behind her professional ambitions. Learning that her husband had created the family he'd claimed was impossible with them felt like the ultimate betrayal stacked on top of countless smaller ones. Dad's recorded voice softened as he addressed me, directly speaking across the divide between life and death, with words I'd waited my entire lifetime to hear. "April, sweetheart, I know I never told you how proud I was of your teaching, your kindness, your determination to help children who reminded me so much of yourself at that age. I know I never said how sorry I was for making you feel less important than your sister's achievements." Tears streamed down my face as I heard my father's voice speaking words of love and recognition that felt like a miracle and a tragedy combined. Why had it taken his approaching death for him to see who I really was? "You chose a life of service over personal gain, and that choice makes you worth more than all of Carla's business successes combined. I'm leaving you everything, not because you need the money, but because I trust you to use it wisely and with the same compassion you've shown your students and your foolish old father." The recording ended with a soft click that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent office. 5 people sat in stunned contemplation of what they'd just witnessed, a man's deathbed confession of parental failure and his desperate attempt to correct 23 years of misguided favoritism. But Attorney Fitzgerald wasn't finished revealing the depths of family betrayal that had motivated Dad's final decisions. Attorney Fitzgerald reached into his briefcase and withdrew a manila envelope marked Wellington Investigation, Priority Evidence. The content spilled across his desk like artifacts from a destroyed marriage, printed text messages, bank statements, hotel receipts, and more photographs that painted a devastating picture of calculated deception. Your father wanted to ensure that all the facts came to light. The attorney explained, organizing the documents with methodical precision. Harold Murphy's investigation went beyond simple surveillance to uncover a systematic pattern of fraud and betrayal that extends far beyond what we've already discussed. Derek sat frozen in his chair, his expensive suit wrinkled and his face the color of old newspaper. Beside him, Carla stared at the evidence with the hollow expression of someone watching their life burn down in real time. The first document Attorney Fitzgerald displayed was a bank statement from Derek and Carla's joint savings account, highlighted to show a series of large withdrawals over the past 6 months. These transfers totaling $32,000 were made to an account belonging to Madison Hartwell without Carla's knowledge or authorization. "That's impossible," Carla whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. "Derek would never. We discuss all major financial decisions together." Uncle Paul leaned forward to examine the bank statements, his engineering background making him comfortable with financial documents. "Carla, these withdrawals happened on weekdays when you would have been at work. Someone with access to your joint account was systematically stealing money to fund a secret life." Derek finally spoke, his voice hoarse and defensive. "Those weren't theft. I was making investments that would benefit both of us in the long run. Madison was helping me research real estate opportunities in emerging markets." Attorney Fitzgerald pulled out printed email exchanges between Derek and Madison that told a very different story. These communications paint a clearer picture of your investment strategy, Mr. Wellington. He began reading from the printed emails, his professional voice making the intimate betrayal even more devastating. From Derek to Madison, dated January 15th. "Can't wait to start our new life in Austin once we get Carla's inheritance money. She has no idea what's coming and honestly doesn't deserve Dad Thompson's business anyway." Carla made a sound like she'd been physically struck. The cruelty of Derek's words seemed to hurt more than the infidelity itself. From Madison to Derek, dated February 2nd. "I've been looking at houses in Westlake Hills. There's a beautiful 4-bedroom with a pool that would be perfect for raising our baby. Carla will be devastated, but she'll get over it eventually." Cousin Jessica shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Derek, how could you plan someone's emotional destruction so casually? Carla loved you. She trusted you completely." "Love doesn't pay gambling debts." Derek snapped his mask of respectability, finally slipping completely. "Carla was so obsessed with her career and her father's approval that she never noticed I was drowning financially. Her inheritance was supposed to solve everything." Aunt Helen's voice cut through Derek's self-pity with surgical precision. "So you decided to steal from your wife and abandon her after using her family connections for years." But the worst revelations were still coming. Attorney Fitzgerald produced medical records from an Austin fertility clinic showing that Derek and Madison had been actively trying to conceive while he was still married to Carla. These appointment records show that Derek and Madison began fertility treatments in November, 4 months before your father's death. They weren't accidentally starting a family. They were deliberately creating the life Derek claimed was impossible with Carla. The medical evidence destroyed Carla's last illusions about her marriage. For years, Derek had told her that his low sperm count made pregnancy unlikely, encouraging her to focus on her career instead of pursuing fertility treatments. Learning that he'd been actively trying to father children with another woman while lying to her about their reproductive options was perhaps the cruelest revelation yet. The pregnancy is already 12 weeks along. Attorney Fitzgerald continued consulting additional medical records. Madison Hartwell is due in October, which means conception occurred while Derek was still actively planning to inherit through Carla. Derek stood abruptly, knocking over his chair in his desperation to escape the mounting evidence. "This is insane. You people are destroying my privacy and my relationship based on the paranoid fantasies of a dying old man." But his protestations were interrupted by a commotion in the hallway outside Attorney Fitzgerald's office. Voices could be heard arguing, and the receptionist was clearly trying to prevent someone from entering the conference room. The door burst open despite the receptionist's efforts, and Madison Hartwell herself walked in, wearing designer maternity clothes that perfectly displayed her growing belly. She was beautiful in an obvious way. Glossy brown hair, perfect makeup clothes that probably cost more than my monthly salary, but her expression carried the entitled arrogance of someone accustomed to getting whatever she wanted. "Derek, honey, I got tired of waiting in the car," Madison announced, completely ignoring the shocked faces around the conference table. "Did you get the inheritance paperwork sorted out? I made dinner reservations at that new steakhouse for 7 o'clock. The silence that greeted Madison's entrance was profound and terrible. She looked around the room with growing confusion, her gaze moving from Derek's guilty face to Carla's devastated expression, to the scattered evidence covering the attorney's desk. "What's going on here?" Madison demanded, her voice taking on a sharp edge. "Derek, why does everyone look like someone died?" "Someone did die," Carla said quietly, finding her voice for the first time since the pregnancy revelation. "My father died, my marriage died, and apparently my best friend died months ago without bothering to mention it." Madison's perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the flush of guilt that colored her cheeks. "Carla, I know this looks bad, but Derek and I never meant for you to find out this way." "How exactly did you mean for me to find out?" Carla asked, standing slowly to face the woman who'd been her confidant since college. "Were you planning to send a postcard from Texas? Maybe a Christmas card featuring your happy family?" Madison glanced nervously at Derek, clearly expecting him to take control of the situation. When he remained silent, staring at the floor like a scolded child, she attempted to justify their actions with breathtaking audacity. "Carla, you have to understand that Derek and I didn't plan for this to happen. We fell in love, and love doesn't follow convenient timelines. Derek was going to tell you everything once your father's estate was settled, and you had the emotional space to process the changes." Uncle Paul made a disgusted sound. "You mean once he'd stolen her inheritance and could afford to abandon her?" "Oh." But Madison had one more devastating revelation to share, one that would complete the destruction of everything Carla thought she knew about her life. The chaos in Attorney Fitzgerald's office reached a crescendo as Madison's presence forced all the hidden betrayals into the open. But the lawyer had been saving one final revelation that would shift the entire dynamic once again. "Ms. Hartwell." He addressed Madison formally. "Your arrival is actually quite convenient. There are some documents you might want to see before you continue with your plans to relocate to Austin." He withdrew yet another folder from his seemingly inexhaustible collection of evidence. "Your boyfriend's gambling debts aren't his only financial obligation. Derek has been using your name and credit information to secure additional loans without your knowledge." Madison's confident expression faltered as Attorney Fitzgerald spread out loan applications bearing her forged signature. "These documents show that Derek has accumulated an additional $68,000 in debt using your identity. As far as creditors are concerned, you're jointly liable for these obligations." "That's impossible," Madison stammered, reaching for the papers with shaking hands. "Derek would never do that to me. We're building a life together." Derek's face went white as his final layer of deception was exposed. He'd been using Madison just as callously as he'd used Carla, viewing both women as financial resources rather than human beings worthy of honesty and respect. "Furthermore," the attorney continued, "the house you purchased in Austin was bought with funds from these fraudulent loans. If Derek can't repay these debts, which seems likely given his current circumstances, you'll both face federal charges for wire fraud and identity theft." Madison dropped into an empty chair, her hand instinctively moving to protect her growing belly. The fairy tale escape she'd imagined was revealing itself as another layer of Derek's criminal behavior. But I found myself less interested in Derek and Madison's unfolding drama than in what Attorney Fitzgerald had mentioned about visiting the inherited property. "When can I see the house?" I asked, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. "We can arrange a visit this afternoon if you'd like," he replied. "Your father left specific instructions about certain items he wanted you to discover personally." 2 hours later, I stood before the imposing Tudor-style mansion where I'd grown up seeing it through completely different eyes. Aunt Helen had insisted on accompanying me, claiming she needed to collect some of Mom's belongings that Dad had preserved in the master bedroom. The house felt both familiar and foreign as we walked through rooms that held decades of family history. Dad had maintained everything beautifully. The hardwood floors gleamed, the windows sparkled, and fresh flowers in crystal vases suggested he'd been preparing for important visitors. "He always kept this place like a museum," Aunt Helen observed, running her fingers along the polished banister. "I think he was afraid that changing anything would make your mother feel more gone than she already was." We climbed the stairs to Dad's private office, a wood-paneled sanctuary I'd rarely been allowed to enter as a child. Attorney Fitzgerald had given me the key, along with instructions to look for a safe hidden behind the bookshelf containing works by American authors. The safe opened easily with the combination Dad had provided my birthday, followed by Mom's. Inside, I discovered treasures that took my breath away. Mom's engagement ring, her pearl necklace, and a collection of jewelry I'd assumed had been sold years ago. "He told Carla these were lost in a burglary," Aunt Helen said, examining Mom's sapphire earrings. "She believed him because she wanted to believe the worst about everything connected to your mother's memory. But the jewelry was just the beginning. Beneath the velvet-lined boxes, I found a stack of letters tied with blue ribbon, love letters between my parents that revealed a romance more beautiful than anything I'd ever imagined. Mom's handwriting covered page after page of cream-colored stationery describing her dreams for their future together, her hopes for their children, and her specific vision for what their family could become. Robert, one letter read, "I love watching you read to April before bedtime. She has your thoughtful nature and my love of stories. I hope someday she'll understand that intelligence comes in many forms and that kindness is rarer and more valuable than success." Another letter, written when I was 5 years old, made me cry. "April asked me today why some people are mean and others are nice. I told her that mean people are usually afraid of something, but nice people have learned that love is stronger than fear. I hope she always chooses love even when love seems harder." Aunt Helen discovered Dad's journal collection in a locked desk drawer, leather-bound volumes documenting 20 years of thoughts and observations about his family. The entries painted a devastating picture of a man who'd recognized his mistakes but didn't know how to correct them. June 15th. One entry read, "Carla graduated with honors today, and I felt proud but also worried. She seems to think success means other people have to fail." When April congratulated her sister, Carla just rolled her eyes and made some comment about participation trophies. I should have said something, but I didn't want to ruin the celebration. Another entry from several years later showed Dad's growing awareness of the family dynamic he'd created. "April won a teaching award today. Teacher of the Year for the entire district. I found out from Helen, not from April herself. She probably didn't think I'd care. God help me, I've made my daughter believe her accomplishments don't matter to me." The most painful entries came from the months before Dad's heart attack, showing his desperate desire to repair our relationship without knowing how to begin. I drove past April's school today and saw her in the playground helping a little boy tie his shoes. She has the same patient smile her mother had when she was teaching April to read. I sat in the car for 20 minutes wanting to go in and tell her how proud I am, but I didn't know what words to use after 20 years of using the wrong ones. But Aunt Helen made a discovery that changed everything we thought we knew about the family finances. Hidden in the basement behind Dad's workbench, she found evidence that Carla had been secretly living in the house for the past 3 months. "April, come look at this," she called from the finished basement where Dad had his workshop and exercise equipment. The basement revealed signs of recent habitation, rumpled bedding on the pull-out sofa, empty takeout containers, and clothing that clearly belonged to Carla. A makeshift office had been set up near the stairs, complete with laptop computer file folders and what appeared to be inventory lists of valuable household items. She's been living here, I said, trying to process this violation of Dad's private space. But why she has that beautiful house in Beechwood with Derek? Aunt Helen picked up one of the file folders and began reading the contents. Her face grew grim as she absorbed what Carla had been documenting. She wasn't just living here, honey. She was cataloging everything valuable for sale. The folders contained detailed lists of antiques, artwork, and collectibles throughout the house, complete with estimated values and contact information for auction houses and estate sale companies. Carla had been systematically preparing to liquidate everything Dad had spent decades collecting and preserving. "Look at this," Aunt Helen said, showing me a notebook filled with Carla's handwriting. "She was planning to sell your mother's piano, the china cabinet that belonged to your grandmother, even your father's military medals from Vietnam." But the most devastating discovery was yet to come. Hidden beneath the inventory lists, I found pawn shop receipts showing that Carla had already sold several pieces of Mom's jewelry items I'd been told were lost or stolen. She'd been systematically looting the family home while Dad was alive, stealing the physical reminders of our shared history to fund her lifestyle and Derek's gambling addiction. The betrayal felt complete and overwhelming. Not content to wait for Dad's death to claim her inheritance, Carla had been stealing from him for months while presenting herself as the dutiful daughter who deserved everything. As we prepared to leave the house, I realized that reclaiming these stolen memories was just the beginning of understanding how extensively my family had been living lies for years. The discovery of Carla's secret residence in our family home felt like the final violation of trust, but I underestimated my sister's capacity for desperate manipulation. Within 48 hours of the will reading, she launched a campaign of destruction that threatened everything I thought I'd gained. The first attack came through legal channels. Carla hired Thomas Kellerman, an expensive probate attorney from downtown Cleveland, who specialized in will contests and family disputes. Kellerman had a reputation for taking cases other lawyers wouldn't touch, especially when substantial inheritance money was involved. Miss Thompson. Kellerman called me at school during my lunch break, his voice smooth and confident. "I represent your sister in what we believe is a clear case of undue influence and elder abuse. We're prepared to file a formal challenge to your father's will unless you're willing to discuss a reasonable settlement." The accusation hit me like ice water. Elder abuse. That's ridiculous. I took care of Dad when he was sick. "Precisely our point," Kellerman replied. "You isolated a vulnerable elderly man during his final illness and manipulated him into changing his will through emotional coercion. We have witnesses who observed your excessive presence at the hospital and your systematic exclusion of other family members from medical decisions." I hung up the phone with shaking hands, realizing that Carla was going to twist every act of love into evidence of manipulation. My dedication to Dad during his recovery was being reframed as predatory behavior designed to steal her inheritance. The legal pressure was only the beginning. That same afternoon, Carla appeared at Lincoln Elementary School during dismissal time, creating a scene in front of parents and students that left me humiliated and professionally endangered. "There she is!" Carla shouted across the parking lot, her voice carrying to every corner of the school grounds. "The woman who convinced my dying father to leave everything to her while she was supposed to be teaching children." Parents stopped their conversations to stare, and several of my third-grade students looked confused and frightened by the commotion. Mrs. Rodriguez, our principal, hurried outside to address the disturbance. "Ma'am, you need to leave school property immediately," Mrs. Rodriguez said firmly. "This is not an appropriate place for personal disputes." But Carla was just getting started. "Do you people know that April Thompson has been lying to everyone about her financial situation? She inherited millions of dollars by manipulating a sick old man, but she's still here pretending to care about education when all she really cares about is money." 8-year-old Tyler Morrison, one of my most sensitive students, started crying as he watched his beloved teacher being attacked by a screaming woman in expensive clothes. I knelt down to comfort him, which gave Carla another opportunity to escalate her public assault. "Look at her. she continued, pointing at me with theatrical disgust. "She's putting on this caring teacher act right now, but she's secretly worth millions. She doesn't belong in this school. She's taking a job away from someone who actually needs it." Security arrived to escort Carla from the premises, but the damage was done. Parents whispered among themselves, students seemed confused about whether I was a good person or a bad person, and I felt the professional reputation I'd built over 8 years crumbling under Carla's vindictive lies. That evening, the harassment continued through social media. Carla had created a Facebook page called Justice for Robert Thompson, where she shared carefully edited stories about Dad's final months. According to her version, I had isolated him from family and friends, controlled his access to visitors, and pressured him into changing his will while he was mentally compromised by medication. The page attracted sympathy from people who didn't know the true story, including some of Dad's former business associates who remembered Carla as his ambitious daughter and me as the quiet one who'd never shown interest in construction or real estate. Robert Thompson would be heartbroken to see how his youngest daughter manipulated his final illness for financial gain. One post read, "April Thompson convinced a dying man to abandon the daughter who'd worked alongside him for 8 years in favor of someone who'd never contributed to his business success." The comments section filled with outrage from people who'd never met me, but were convinced I was a calculating manipulator who'd stolen my sister's rightful inheritance through elder abuse. But Carla's most dangerous scheme involved directly targeting my employment. She contacted the Cleveland Board of Education with allegations that I was using my position as a teacher to hide my true financial status and avoid paying appropriate taxes on my inheritance. "Teachers are supposed to be honest role models for children," she told whoever would listen. "How can someone who's worth $4 million pretend to understand the struggles of working families? She's a fraud who's taking advantage of a system designed to help people who actually need teaching jobs." The pressure from multiple directions was overwhelming. Legal threats, professional sabotage, public humiliation, and social media attacks were destroying my peace of mind and threatening my career. Carla had weaponized grief and family conflict to punish me for Dad's decision. But her most shocking violation came when I discovered she'd been systematically draining the estate accounts that should have been frozen during probate. Attorney Fitzgerald called me at home on Friday evening, his voice tight with anger and concern. "April, we have a serious problem. Someone has been writing checks from your father's business account using forged signatures. 3 checks totaling $27,000 have been cashed in the past week." "How is that possible?" I asked. "Shouldn't all the accounts be protected during the probate process?" "They should be, but the checks were written before your father's death and post-dated for this week. It's a sophisticated fraud that suggests someone had been planning this theft for months." Bank security footage confirmed what we all suspected. Carla had been using Dad's checkbook to write herself payments that she was now cashing as if they were legitimate business expenses. She'd covered her tracks by creating fake invoices for marketing services that Thompson Construction had supposedly purchased before Dad's death. The evidence of financial fraud was clear and criminal, but Carla's willingness to steal money that legally belonged to me, while simultaneously accusing me of manipulation, showed how desperate she'd become. She was destroying herself through her own choices, but she was determined to take me down with her. As I sat in my small apartment that Friday night, surrounded by legal papers and feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of Carla's vindictive campaign, I realized that inheriting Dad's wealth had given me more than money. It had revealed the true character of everyone in my family. The following Monday morning, I walked into the downtown Cleveland offices of Walsh & Associates with attorney Sarah Walsh, feeling like David approaching Goliath, with nothing but determination and the truth. Sarah was a formidable woman in her 50s who specialized in defending legitimate wills against frivolous challenges, and her reputation for destroying fraudulent claims had made her attorney Fitzgerald's first recommendation. "April," she said as we settled into her conference room with windows overlooking the Cuyahoga River, I want you to understand that probate contests can get very ugly very quickly. Your sister has hired an attorney who wins by making accusers look sympathetic and beneficiaries look greedy. We're going to counter that strategy by sticking relentlessly to facts and evidence. The deposition process began that same week, and I quickly learned that legal proceedings bear no resemblance to television courtroom dramas. Instead of dramatic confrontations, we sat in sterile conference rooms while court reporters recorded every word of testimony that felt both boring and terrifying. Carla's deposition revealed the weakness of her case almost immediately. Under oath, she couldn't provide specific examples of how I'd isolated Dad or manipulated his medical care. Her accusations fell apart when confronted with hospital visitor logs showing that she'd visited once while I'd been there daily. Can you describe any instance where April prevented you from seeing your father? Attorney Walsh asked during cross-examination. Carla shifted uncomfortably in her chair, realizing her vague accusations wouldn't survive specific questioning. She was always there when I tried to visit. It made private conversations impossible. What private conversations did you want to have with your father while he was recovering from heart surgery? Family business, construction projects, things April wouldn't understand because she's not involved in real estate development. Attorney Walsh consulted her notes with surgical precision. According to hospital records, your father was sedated and sleeping during most of your March 3rd visit. What family business were you able to discuss with an unconscious patient? The question hung in the air like a trap Carla had walked into willingly. She'd claimed to want private business conversations with Dad, but the medical records showed he'd been unconscious during her visit. Derek's deposition was even more devastating to Carla's case. Attorney Walsh had subpoenaed him as a witness, forcing him to testify about his gambling debts and his knowledge of Carla's theft from estate accounts. Mr. Wellington, were you aware that your wife was taking money from her father's accounts before his death? Derek glanced nervously at Carla's attorney, clearly wishing he could invoke spousal privilege to avoid answering. I knew she sometimes handled business expenses for the construction company. Were you aware that these business expenses included $27,000 in payments to herself for services that were never provided? I didn't know the specific amounts. Derek admitted, his voice barely audible. But you did know she was stealing money to cover your gambling debts. Thomas Kellerman objected strenuously, but Derek had already nodded, effectively destroying any credibility Carla might have retained. The testimony from Madison Hartwell provided additional ammunition for our defense. Madison had agreed to cooperate with our attorneys in exchange for immunity from prosecution for her role in Derek's fraud schemes. Miss Hartwell. Attorney Walsh began, did Carla Wellington ever discuss her plans for her father's estate before his death? Madison looked uncomfortable but answered honestly under oath. She said the inheritance would solve all their financial problems. Derek had told her about his gambling debts, and they were both counting on her father's money to start fresh. Did she express any concern about her father's health or emotional well-being during his final illness? Not really. She mostly complained about having to visit the hospital because it interfered with her work schedule. But the most powerful testimony came from unexpected sources, Dad's former employees and business associates who had witnessed Carla's behavior over the years. Frank Martinez, Dad's foreman for 15 years, testified about overhearing conversations between Carla and Derek about selling the family business immediately upon inheritance. Miss Carla never showed real interest in construction, Frank stated matter-of-factly. She wanted the money, but not the work. She told Derek the business was worth more dead than alive because the property could be developed for retail. Margaret Chen, Dad's bookkeeper since I was in high school, provided devastating testimony about Carla's financial irregularities in the months before Dad's death. I noticed unusual withdrawals and payments that didn't match any legitimate business expenses, Margaret testified. When I asked Robert about them, he seemed confused and asked me to document everything carefully. He said he wanted to understand where his money was going. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, Dad's cardiologist, testified that Dad's mental acuity had remained sharp throughout his illness and recovery. Robert Thompson was completely lucid during our discussions about his treatment options, Dr. Walsh stated firmly. He understood complex medical information and made informed decisions about his care. He showed no signs of cognitive impairment or vulnerability to coercion. But the most damaging evidence against Carla came from her own digital footprint. Attorney Walsh had subpoenaed her phone records, email accounts, and social media activity, revealing a pattern of deception and manipulation that extended far beyond the estate theft. Text messages between Carla and Derek showed their true feelings about Dad and their plans for his money. Derek: how long do you think the old man has left? Carla: hopefully not long. I'm tired of pretending to care about his war stories and his boring construction projects. Derek: once we get the inheritance, we can sell everything and move somewhere with better weather and fewer family obligations. Email exchanges with Madison revealed the depth of their conspiracy. Carla: Derek and I have been talking about relocating after Dad dies. Would you be interested in a fresh start somewhere new? Madison: are you sure you'll have the resources to support a major life change? Carla: trust me, Dad's estate will give us more than enough freedom to do whatever we want. The digital evidence painted a picture of three people who viewed Dad's death as a financial opportunity rather than a family tragedy. Their casual discussions about his mortality and their plans for his money showed the court exactly what kind of character we were dealing with. Judge Patricia Morrison, who was overseeing the probate proceedings, began showing visible irritation with Carla's legal team as the evidence mounted against their claims. Mr. Kellerman. Judge Morrison said during a pretrial hearing, "Your client's accusations of elder abuse seem to be contradicted by substantial evidence of her own financial misconduct. Are you prepared to withdraw these allegations, or do you want to proceed to trial, knowing that your client could face criminal charges for perjury?" But Carla's desperation had reached the point where rational considerations no longer applied. She was determined to pursue her claims regardless of the evidence, apparently believing that her years of manipulating family dynamics would somehow work on the legal system as well. The most shocking revelation came when the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit confirmed they were investigating Carla for multiple federal offenses related to her theft schemes. Special Agent Catherine Ross contacted Attorney Walsh directly. "We've been tracking financial irregularities in several businesses connected to Robert Thompson's construction company. Your client's sister appears to have been running sophisticated fraud operations for at least 2 years before her father's death." The investigation revealed that Carla had been creating false vendor accounts and billing Thompson Construction for services that were never provided. She'd stolen over $80,000 through this scheme money that should have been part of Dad's estate. But Carla had one more desperate card to play, one that would reveal the true depths of her willingness to destroy anything and anyone to get what she wanted. While Carla's legal and social media attacks continued to rain down on me like arrows from a vengeful army, something unexpected began happening at Lincoln Elementary School. The parents and colleagues who'd witnessed her public outburst started rallying to my defense in ways that restored my faith in human decency. It began with Mrs. Patricia Gonzalez, whose daughter Maria had been in my class 2 years earlier. Patricia worked as a paralegal downtown and understood enough about legal proceedings to recognize harassment when she saw it. "Miss Thompson," she said after school on Tuesday, approaching my classroom door with a determined expression, "I want you to know that some of us parents have been talking and we think what your sister is doing is disgraceful. Maria still talks about how you helped her with reading when she was struggling and how you stayed after school every day until she felt confident." Her words broke something loose in my chest that I hadn't realized was tightly held. "Thank you, Mrs. Gonzalez. That means more than you know. We're not just offering sympathy." She continued pulling a folder from her purse. "I've drafted a letter to the school board defending your character, and 37 parents have signed it so far. We're also sending copies to the local newspapers because people need to know who you really are." The letter, written in Patricia's clear legal prose, painted a picture of my teaching career that I barely recognized as my own. It described countless hours of unpaid tutoring, weekend trips to purchase school supplies with my own money, and my annual tradition of providing winter coats for students whose families couldn't afford them. April Thompson represents everything good about public education. The letter concluded. She chose teaching not because she couldn't succeed elsewhere, but because she understood that shaping young minds is the most important work in our society. Any attempt to portray her as greedy or manipulative demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of her character. By Thursday, the letter had 62 signatures and had been printed in both the Cleveland Plain Dealer and the Suburban Sun News. The response from the community was swift and overwhelming. Former colleagues from my previous schools wrote testimonials about my dedication and integrity. Dr. Susan Martinez, my supervising professor during student teaching, contacted the Board of Education to praise my classroom management and innovative literacy programs. Even parents whose children I'd taught 5 years ago took time to share stories about my positive impact on their families. But the most meaningful support came from my current students who didn't understand the adult drama swirling around their classroom, but recognized that their teacher was sad and stressed. 8-year-old Emma Rodriguez drew me a picture during art time, a stick figure woman surrounded by hearts with "Best Teacher Ever" written in purple crayon across the top. When she handed it to me, she whispered, "Miss Thompson, my mom says some people are being mean to you, but we all love you very much." Tyler Morrison, the sensitive boy who'd cried during Carla's parking lot outburst, organized his classmates to write me encouraging notes during recess. 23 handwritten messages covered my desk the next morning. "Dear Miss Thompson, you are nice and smart, and you help me read good. Jason. I hope you feel better soon. Do you want to borrow my stuffed elephant? He makes me happy when I'm sad. Sophia. My dad says your sister is jealous because you're a better person than her. Kevin." Reading those innocent expressions of loyalty made me cry in my empty classroom, but they were healing tears that reminded me why I'd chosen teaching in the first place. The professional support extended beyond Lincoln Elementary. Dr. Margaret Stevens, superintendent of Cleveland City Schools, called me personally to express her confidence in my integrity and to assure me that the district would not be swayed by what she termed obvious harassment tactics. "April," she said during our phone conversation, "I've reviewed your personnel file and your performance evaluations are consistently outstanding. Your principals describe you as dedicated, innovative, and beloved by students and parents alike. We're not going to let someone's personal vendetta damage our assessment of your professional value." Principal Rodriguez went further, offering me the position of lead literacy coordinator for the entire district, a promotion that would increase my salary and provide opportunities to mentor new teachers. "This job was designed for someone with your skills and passion," she explained during our meeting. "We've been looking for the right candidate for months, and your situation has reminded us that we already have exactly the person we need right here." The irony wasn't lost on me. Carla's attempts to destroy my career were actually highlighting my professional accomplishments in ways that led to unexpected opportunities. But the most surprising support came from Dad's former business associates, men I'd barely known who reached out to share their memories of our family dynamics over the years. Robert Mitchell, who'd worked with Thompson Construction on several major projects, called me at home one evening with stories I'd never heard. "Your father talked about you constantly," he said, his gruff voice warm with affection. Every time one of his projects involved schools or community centers, he'd mention how proud he was of your teaching work. He said you were doing more important work than any of us contractors because you were building people instead of buildings. James Patterson, Dad's longtime attorney before he'd switched to Fitzgerald's firm, shared similar memories. Robert always regretted not supporting your career choice more openly. He told me several times that he wished he'd been smart enough to see that success comes in many forms, not just financial ones. These conversations revealed that Dad had been proud of me all along, but hadn't known how to express it. His awkwardness around emotional topics had been mistaken for indifference, when in reality he'd been struggling with his own inability to articulate love and admiration. The community support created a protective bubble around me during the darkest period of Carla's harassment campaign. Local media began covering the story from a different angle, portraying me as a dedicated educator, being persecuted by a greedy sibling, rather than as a manipulative gold digger stealing family wealth. Channel 5's Evening News ran a segment titled Teacher Under Fire that included interviews with parents, students, and colleagues who contradicted every accusation Carla had made about my character. "Miss Thompson changed my son's life," one parent told the reporter. "He was failing in reading until she developed a special program just for him. She stayed after school every day for 2 months working with him for free until he caught up with his classmates." The news coverage attracted attention from unexpected quarters. The Ohio Education Association offered to provide legal support if the school district faced any pressure to terminate my employment. The National Education Foundation sent a letter commending my dedication and expressing solidarity with teachers facing personal attacks. But perhaps most importantly, the outpouring of support helped me understand that my identity wasn't defined by Carla's accusations or by Dad's inheritance. I was valued for who I'd chosen to become, not for my family's wealth or dysfunction. Standing in my classroom surrounded by student artwork and thank you notes from parents, I realized that Carla's attacks had inadvertently given me something precious, absolute clarity about my own worth, and the genuine appreciation of a community that had watched me grow from a young teacher into someone they trusted with their children's futures. However, this community support would soon be tested when federal investigators made a discovery that would change everyone's understanding of what Carla had really been doing behind the scenes. The call from Special Agent Catherine Ross came on a gray Thursday morning while I was helping my students with their science projects about plant growth. Mrs. Rodriguez appeared in my classroom doorway with an expression that suggested something serious was developing. "April, you have an important phone call in my office," she said quietly. "I'll watch your class." Special Agent Ross's voice was crisp and professional, but I could hear underlying concern that made my stomach clench with anxiety. "Miss Thompson, we need to schedule a meeting to discuss our investigation into your sister's financial activities. What we've discovered goes far beyond the estate fraud we initially documented." 2 hours later, I sat in a downtown FBI office that felt like something from a crime drama, complete with fluorescent lighting and institutional furniture that seemed designed to make everyone uncomfortable. Agent Ross, a woman in her 40s with graying hair and intelligent eyes, spread documents across the conference table with methodical precision. "Your sister has been operating what we classify as a sophisticated white-collar crime network." She began her words hitting me like physical blows. "The theft from your father's estate was just one component of a larger pattern of fraud that extends back at least 3 years. The evidence was overwhelming and horrifying. Carla had been using Thompson Construction's vendor database to create fake companies that billed for services never provided. She'd invented businesses with official-sounding names like Midwest Marketing Solutions and Professional Development Consulting that existed only on paper but had received hundreds of thousands of dollars in payments. How did she hide this from Dad?" I asked, trying to understand how such extensive theft could go unnoticed. "Your father trusted her completely," Agent Ross explained. "She had signature authority on business accounts and handled most vendor payments. The fake companies she created looked legitimate on invoices, and she was careful to keep individual payments small enough to avoid triggering automatic audits. Bank records showed that Carla had stolen over $200,000 from Thompson Construction, over 3 years' money that should have been part of Dad's estate, but had instead funded her luxury lifestyle and Derek's gambling addiction. But the fraud extended beyond simple theft. Agent Ross revealed that Carla had been running credit card scams using stolen information from Dad's business clients. She had access to customer information through Thompson Construction's database, the agent explained. She used that data to apply for credit cards in other people's names, then had the cards sent to post office boxes she'd rented under false identities. The scope of Carla's criminal activity was staggering. She'd victimized dozens of innocent people, destroying their credit ratings and financial security to fund her shopping habits and Derek's gambling debts. Families had lost their homes, students had been denied college loans, and elderly people had faced bankruptcy because of Carla's systematic identity theft. We estimate total damages at approximately $400,000, Agent Ross continued. This doesn't include the emotional and financial costs to the victims whose lives she disrupted. Derek's cooperation with federal investigators had revealed the extent of his knowledge about Carla's crimes. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he'd provided detailed information about their money laundering schemes and their plans to flee to Texas using stolen funds. Mr. Wellington has admitted to helping your sister move money through multiple bank accounts to disguise its illegal origins, Agent Ross said. He also confirmed that they were planning to disappear once they gained access to your father's inheritance. The recorded conversations between Derek and federal agents played during our meeting revealed the callousness with which they discussed their victims. Derek: how many credit cards did you get approved this week? Carla, 5, but I'm being more careful about the amounts. Small purchases are less likely to trigger investigations. Derek: good. We need to build up cash reserves before Robert dies and we can make our move to Austin. Listening to them discuss Dad's approaching death like a business opportunity made me physically ill. They'd viewed his mortality as a deadline for maximizing their theft before disappearing with millions of dollars in stolen money. But Carla's criminal behavior had escalated beyond financial fraud into active attempts to obstruct justice. Agent Ross revealed that Carla had tried to bribe a hospital nurse to provide false testimony about my behavior during Dad's final illness. She offered Nurse Jennifer Walsh $5,000 to claim you had been inappropriate with your father's medical care, the agent explained. Nurse Walsh reported the bribery attempt immediately, and we have recorded conversations documenting your sister's efforts to manufacture evidence against you. The recorded phone calls were damning evidence of Carla's desperation and complete lack of moral boundaries. Carla: all you have to say is that April seemed to be influencing her father inappropriately, maybe keeping him isolated from other family members. Nurse Walsh: but that's not true. April was wonderful with her father. She was respectful, caring, and never interfered with our medical procedures. Carla, truth isn't the point here. I'm offering you $5,000 for a simple statement that could help resolve a family dispute. The bribery attempt was a federal crime that carried serious penalties, but it also demonstrated how far Carla was willing to go to destroy my reputation and steal the inheritance she felt she deserved. Madison Hartwell's testimony had provided additional evidence of Carla's criminal planning. Madison admitted that she'd helped Carla forge documents and create false business records in exchange for promises of financial security once they moved to Texas. Miss Hartwell has agreed to testify against your sister in exchange for reduced charges, Agent Ross explained. Her cooperation has been valuable in documenting the full extent of the conspiracy. But perhaps the most shocking revelation was that Carla had been systematically destroying evidence for weeks, assuming she could eliminate any proof of her criminal activity. We executed a search warrant on her residence yesterday, Agent Ross said, pulling out photographs that showed the destruction. She'd been burning documents, wiping computer hard drives, and disposing of phones she'd used for fraudulent activities. The photographs showed Carla's desperation in vivid detail: a backyard fire pit filled with charred paper remains, computers that had been physically destroyed with hammers, and boxes of shredded documents that federal experts were attempting to reconstruct. Destruction of evidence is another federal crime, Agent Ross noted. It shows consciousness of guilt and adds additional charges to her already substantial legal problems. The federal investigation had also uncovered evidence that Carla was planning additional crimes even while fighting the will contest. She'd been researching ways to transfer money out of the country and had contacted lawyers about challenging the inheritance from overseas jurisdictions where extradition might be more difficult. Your sister was preparing for the possibility that her legal challenges would fail, Agent Ross explained. She was planning to steal whatever money she could access and flee the country to avoid prosecution. The meeting concluded with Agent Ross explaining the charges that would be filed against Carla: federal wire fraud, identity theft, money laundering, bribery, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. The potential penalties included decades in federal prison and complete financial forfeiture. Mr. Wellington has already agreed to plead guilty and cooperate with our investigation, the agent said. Miss Hartwell will face reduced charges in exchange for her testimony. Your sister, however, has refused all plea negotiations and insists she's done nothing wrong. As I left the FBI office, I realized that Carla's world was about to collapse completely through her own choices and actions. The sister who'd called me a failure and a disappointment was facing federal prison time for crimes that showed a level of calculation and cruelty I'd never imagined possible. But there was one more devastating revelation still to come, one that would finally expose the depths of Carla's hatred for our family and her willingness to destroy anyone who stood between her and what she wanted. Dr. Rebecca Martinez had been my therapist for only 2 sessions, but she'd already helped me understand that processing my father's death and Carla's betrayal would require more than just legal victories. Sitting in her comfortable office with its soft lighting and strategically placed tissue boxes, I was learning to separate my own emotions from the chaos my sister had created. April, Dr. Martinez said gently, "It's important to understand that your father's favoritism toward Carla wasn't really about you or your worth. Family dynamics are often shaped by unresolved grief and trauma that children never see." Aunt Helen had agreed to join our 3rd session, bringing with her a perspective on our family history that I'd never heard before. At 72, she was the only person left who remembered the early years of Dad's marriage to my mother and the circumstances that had shaped his relationship with both his daughters. "Your father married Patricia when he was barely 21. Aunt Helen began settling into the therapist's comfortable chair with a photo album she'd brought from home. Patricia was beautiful, ambitious, and completely wrong for a man who wanted a traditional family life. The photographs showed a young woman who looked remarkably like Carla: blonde hair, sharp features, and an expression that suggested she was already looking beyond whatever moment was being captured. Dad appeared young and besotted, clearly head over heels, in love with someone who would ultimately break his heart. Patricia left when Carla was 18 months old. Aunt Helen continued, her voice heavy with old sadness. She'd been having an affair with her boss at the advertising agency where she worked. One day, Robert came home from work and Patricia was gone. She'd taken her clothes, her jewelry, and most of their savings, leaving only a note saying she wasn't meant for motherhood or small-town life. The revelation explained so much about Dad's relationship with Carla. He'd raised her alone for 4 years, projecting all his love and hope onto a little girl who reminded him daily of the woman who'd abandoned them both. "When your father met your mother, Linda, he was terrified of getting hurt again," Aunt Helen said, showing me photos of my parents' courtship. Linda was everything Patricia wasn't: kind, gentle, interested in building a home rather than escaping from one. But Robert was afraid to trust completely, even though Linda loved him unconditionally. The pictures showed Mom's patience with Dad's emotional walls and her genuine affection for 4-year-old Carla, who had apparently resented any woman who took attention away from her father. Linda tried so hard to be a good stepmother to Carla. Aunt Helen continued, but Carla had already learned to compete for Robert's attention. She would throw tantrums whenever he showed affection to Linda, and she seemed to understand instinctively that her resemblance to Patricia gave her power over him. Dr. Martinez listened carefully before asking the question that cut to the heart of our family dysfunction. How did this dynamic affect Robert's relationship with April when she was born? Aunt Helen's answer revealed the tragic irony that had shaped my entire childhood. April looked exactly like Linda. Same dark hair, same gentle eyes, same quiet personality. Robert loved her deeply, but seeing her was also painful because she reminded him so much of the woman he'd learned to love, but was afraid to trust completely. The photographs from my early childhood showed the visual proof of Aunt Helen's observations. Where Carla had always been posed and performance-ready even as a toddler, I appeared contemplative and book-focused, usually sitting close to Mom while she read to me or helped me with art projects. "Your father didn't know how to navigate his own emotions," Dr. Martinez observed, so he defaulted to favoring the daughter who reminded him of his first love while keeping emotional distance from the daughter who reminded him of vulnerability and genuine intimacy. Aunt Helen pulled out letters Dad had written to her over the years, documents that revealed his growing awareness of his own mistakes as a parent. Reading his private thoughts was like discovering a completely different person hidden behind the emotionally distant father I'd known. I watch April with her students. One letter from 5 years ago read, "And I see Linda's same patient kindness." April chose to dedicate her life to helping other people's children learn and grow, while Carla seems only interested in what other people can do for her. I've been rewarding the wrong values for 20 years, but I don't know how to change course without admitting how wrong I've been. Another letter, written just 6 months before his heart attack, showed Dad's desperate desire to repair our relationship. I drove past Lincoln Elementary today and watched April on playground duty. She was kneeling in the dirt to comfort a crying first grader completely unconcerned about her clothes or her schedule. I sat in my car for 30 minutes wanting to walk over and tell her how proud I am, but I've been distant for so long that I don't know how to bridge the gap I created. The most painful letter was dated 2 weeks after Mom's death from cancer when I was 16. I look at April and see Linda so clearly that it takes my breath away. She has the same quiet strength, the same way of making people feel cared for just by listening to them, but I'm afraid that getting close to April means risking the same kind of loss I experienced when Linda died. It's easier to maintain distance than to risk loving someone so much that losing them would destroy me again. Reading Dad's private struggles with grief and fear helped me understand that his emotional distance hadn't been about my worthiness, but about his own inability to handle the intensity of love and loss. He'd protected himself by favoring the daughter who seemed strong and independent, while avoiding the daughter who reminded him of the depth of connection he'd found with Mom. "Carla represented safety to your father," Dr. Martinez explained. "She was demanding and self-sufficient, which meant he could provide for her without risking emotional vulnerability. You represented the possibility of deep love, which felt dangerous to someone who'd been abandoned and bereaved." But Aunt Helen had brought one more revelation that would completely change my understanding of our family's financial history. Hidden in Dad's papers, she'd found documentation showing that he'd been secretly supporting my education and career for years, despite Carla's claims that I'd been cut off financially. "Your father paid off your student loans," Aunt Helen said, producing canceled checks and payment records. "He also made anonymous donations to Lincoln Elementary that funded the reading program you developed and the classroom supplies you were buying with your own money." The evidence was overwhelming. Dad had been watching my career and supporting it financially while allowing me to believe I was struggling alone. He'd paid for my teaching certification, funded my master's degree classes, and even arranged for Thompson Construction to sponsor several school fundraising events I'd organized. "Why didn't he tell me?" I asked, overwhelmed by this evidence of secret love and support. "Because he thought you were better off believing you'd achieved everything independently," Aunt Helen replied. "He was proud of your integrity and didn't want you to feel obligated to him or dependent on family money." The revelation reframed my entire understanding of Dad's character. He'd been supporting my values and career choice while publicly seeming to favor Carla's ambition. His final will hadn't been a sudden change of heart, but the culmination of years of quiet observation and growing respect for the woman I'd become. "Your father spent his final months researching literacy programs and education funding," Aunt Helen continued. "He was planning to establish a foundation to support teachers like you, but he ran out of time to implement his vision." Learning about Dad's hidden love and support felt like receiving a gift from beyond the grave. The father I'd thought was emotionally distant and disapproving had actually been my secret champion, working behind the scenes to ensure my success, while respecting my need to feel independent and accomplished. But this new understanding of Dad's love also highlighted the tragic irony of Carla's behavior. The daughter he'd favored and supported had betrayed him completely, while the daughter he'd struggled to connect with had been the one to embody the values he'd ultimately come to treasure most. As our therapy session concluded, Dr. Martinez helped me see that healing from family trauma meant understanding the pain that had shaped everyone's choices without excusing the harm those choices had caused. "Your father made mistakes based on his own unhealed wounds," she said. "Carla made choices based on entitlement and greed. Understanding the difference will help you move forward with both forgiveness and appropriate boundaries." Judge Patricia Morrison's courtroom felt like a cathedral of justice as we gathered for the final hearing on Carla's will contest. After 3 months of depositions, evidence gathering, and legal maneuvering, the moment had arrived for a definitive ruling that would determine the legitimacy of Dad's final wishes. Carla sat at the plaintiff's table wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary, but her usual confidence had been replaced by the hollow-eyed desperation of someone watching their entire life crumble. Thomas Kellerman, her expensive attorney, shuffled through papers with the resigned air of a lawyer who knew his case was hopeless but was obligated to see it through to its inevitable conclusion. After reviewing all evidence, testimony, and documentation presented during these proceedings, Judge Morrison began, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "This court finds the claims of undue influence and elder abuse to be completely without merit." Attorney Walsh squeezed my hand supportively as the judge continued her devastating assessment of Carla's legal challenge. "In fact," Judge Morrison said, looking directly at Carla with undisguised disapproval, "the evidence reveals that Robert Thompson's decision to change his will was not only legally sound, but morally justified, given the systematic theft and betrayal he discovered in his final months." The judge's words struck Carla like physical blows. Her face went white as Judge Morrison enumerated the evidence that had destroyed any sympathy for her position. "The court has found clear and convincing evidence that Mrs. Wellington forged documents, stole money from estate accounts, and attempted to bribe witnesses to provide false testimony. These actions constitute serious criminal behavior that validates rather than undermines her father's decision to disinherit her." Judge Morrison's ruling was comprehensive, and final Dad's will would be upheld in its entirety. Carla's challenge was dismissed with prejudice, and she would be responsible for paying all legal fees incurred during the probate contest. Furthermore, the judge continued, "Given the evidence of fraud and theft presented during these proceedings, this court is referring Mrs. Wellington's actions to the appropriate prosecutorial authorities for criminal investigation." The legal fees alone would bankrupt Carla. Her attorney's bills had exceeded $60,000, and she would also be responsible for the costs of our legal defense. Combined with the federal charges already filed against her, she faced complete financial ruin in addition to decades in prison. But Judge Morrison wasn't finished delivering justice. She addressed Carla directly with the kind of moral condemnation that would follow her for the rest of her life. "Mrs. Wellington, your behavior throughout these proceedings has been appalling. You have attempted to steal your sister's rightful inheritance through lies, forgery, and witness intimidation. You have dishonored your father's memory and shown complete disregard for the legal system's pursuit of truth and justice." Carla's mask of composure finally cracked completely. She began crying, not the elegant tears of someone seeking sympathy, but the ugly, desperate sobs of someone confronting the consequences of their own choices. Derek wasn't present for the final hearing. He'd already pleaded guilty to federal fraud charges and was serving 18 months in minimum security prison, while cooperating with investigators to build cases against Carla and other participants in their criminal enterprise. Madison had given birth to Derek's son 2 weeks earlier and was facing her own legal consequences while trying to care for a newborn whose father was in prison and whose paternity had been established through court-ordered DNA testing. The federal sentencing hearing took place the following month in a downtown courthouse that felt even more imposing than Judge Morrison's probate court. Special Agent Ross testified about the scope of Carla's crimes, presenting evidence that painted a picture of someone who'd been systematically victimizing innocent people for years. Mrs. Wellington showed sophisticated criminal planning and complete disregard for the harm she caused to dozens of victims. Agent Ross told federal judge David Chen. Her fraud schemes destroyed families' financial security and demonstrated a pattern of escalating criminal behavior that would have continued indefinitely if not for her father's death and the subsequent investigation. The victim impact statements were heartbreaking. Elderly people described losing their homes due to ruined credit ratings. Young families shared stories of being denied mortgages because of identity theft they'd never discovered until Carla's arrest. Students had been forced to abandon college plans when fraudulent credit accounts destroyed their ability to secure educational loans. Margaret Williams, 73 years old, lost her house and had to move in with relatives because Carla Wellington stole her identity and destroyed her credit rating. One prosecutor read, Mrs. Williams had never heard of Thompson Construction or Carla Wellington, but her retirement was ruined by crimes she didn't even know had been committed against her. Judge Chen's sentencing reflected the severity of Carla's crimes and her complete lack of remorse. She received 42 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. All her assets would be forfeited to pay restitution to victims, and she would be prohibited from working in any position involving financial responsibilities. Mrs. Wellington, you have shown no remorse for the extensive harm you've caused to innocent people, Judge Chen stated during sentencing. Your crimes were motivated by greed and executed with callous disregard for your victims' well-being. This sentence reflects the seriousness of your offenses and the need to protect the public from your criminal behavior. Carla's final attempt at manipulation came during her allocation, the opportunity for defendants to address the court before sentencing. Instead of accepting responsibility, she launched into a bitter diatribe about family unfairness and her belief that she'd been the victim of a conspiracy. My father was manipulated by people who wanted to destroy his relationship with his successful daughter, she told Judge Chen, her voice rising with indignation. I built his business into something profitable, and my sister never contributed anything except false sympathy and emotional manipulation. The allocation backfired spectacularly. Judge Chen's expression grew colder as Carla continued blaming everyone except herself for the consequences of her criminal choices. Mrs. Wellington, your complete inability to accept responsibility for your actions confirms that you pose an ongoing danger to society, the judge responded. Your statement demonstrates the same entitlement and lack of empathy that motivated your crimes in the first place. But Carla had one final desperate card to play, one last manipulation that would reveal the absolute depths of her willingness to lie for personal advantage. As the bailiffs prepared to take her into custody, she suddenly claimed to be pregnant and suffering from a medical emergency that required immediate attention. Your Honor, I need to be taken to a hospital, she announced, dramatically placing her hands on her stomach and assuming an expression of distress. I'm pregnant, and the stress of this unfair proceeding is threatening my unborn child. The courtroom fell silent as everyone processed this unexpected claim. If true, it could affect her sentencing and imprisonment conditions. Judge Chen ordered an immediate medical evaluation to determine the validity of Carla's pregnancy claim. The results delivered 2 hours later provided the final proof of Carla's character. Medical tests confirmed that she was not pregnant and never had been. She'd fabricated a pregnancy in a desperate attempt to gain sympathy and delay her imprisonment. Mrs. Wellington has just committed perjury in federal court, Judge Chen announced when proceedings resumed. Her false claim of pregnancy demonstrates that she will lie about anything if she thinks it might benefit her. The pregnancy lie added additional charges and eliminated any possibility of Carla receiving consideration for cooperation or remorse. She was immediately taken into custody to begin serving her sentence with no possibility of reduced time for good behavior given her attempt to deceive the court. As I watched my sister being led away in handcuffs, I felt an unexpected emotion, not satisfaction or revenge, but profound sadness for the person she could have been if she'd chosen differently. The sister who'd tormented me for decades was finally facing consequences for her actions, but there was no joy in watching someone destroy themselves so completely through their own choices. The inheritance that had caused so much conflict was now officially and permanently mine, but more importantly, I was finally free from the family dynamics that had defined and constrained my entire life. 6 months after Carla's sentencing, I stood in the foyer of the family mansion watching contractors install a brass plaque that read, "Robert Thompson Memorial Foundation for Educational Excellence." The house that had once represented painful childhood memories was being transformed into something that honored both Dad's legacy and Mom's dreams for helping children through education. The renovation had been extensive but respectful of the home's character. Dad's former office became the foundation's headquarters, where I worked with a small staff to evaluate scholarship applications and develop programs for supporting new teachers entering the profession. The formal dining room was converted into a conference space where we hosted workshops on innovative teaching methods and literacy development. The living room where our family had gathered for uncomfortable holiday meals, marked by Dad's favoritism and Carla's cruelty, now served as a library where local teachers could check out resources and students could receive free tutoring. Mom's favorite sunroom became a quiet reading space, filled with comfortable chairs and natural light that reminded me of her gentle presence. The Foundation's mission reflected everything I'd learned about the importance of supporting education and recognizing that success comes in many forms. Our first program provided full scholarships for students from low-income families who wanted to pursue teaching careers. Within 6 months, we'd funded 12 scholarships at various Ohio universities, giving future educators the financial freedom to focus on their studies, rather than working multiple jobs to pay for college. The second program addressed something I'd experienced personally, the financial burden teachers faced when buying classroom supplies with their own money. The Foundation established supply grants that provided $500 annually to teachers in high-need schools, allowing them to create engaging learning environments without sacrificing their personal finances. But the program I was most proud of addressed the housing challenges new teachers faced in expensive urban districts. Using income from the rental properties Dad had left me, the Foundation purchased modest homes near urban schools and rented them to beginning teachers at below-market rates. Young educators could afford decent housing while building experience in schools that desperately needed committed teachers. The financial success of these programs was possible because I'd been conservative and strategic with the inheritance. Rather than spending extravagantly or investing in risky ventures, I'd worked with financial advisors to create sustainable income streams that would fund educational initiatives for decades to come. Thompson Construction and Development continued operating under the management of Frank Martinez, Dad's former foreman, who'd proven to be an excellent businessman with a genuine understanding of the company's values. We focused on building affordable housing and community facilities rather than luxury developments generating steady profits while serving families who needed quality homes at reasonable prices. The personal transformation that accompanied these professional changes was equally significant. Living in the family mansion hadn't been easy initially. Too many rooms held memories of childhood isolation and family conflict. But gradually creating new memories through foundation work and community gatherings had helped me reclaim the space as something positive and purposeful. The most unexpected change was the relationship that developed with Brian Richardson, a fourth-grade teacher at Roosevelt Elementary, who'd attended one of our foundation workshops on reading intervention strategies. Brian was thoughtful, funny, and completely unimpressed by my financial situation. He valued my dedication to education and my genuine care for children, seeing me as a fellow teacher rather than as an heiress or a charity leader. Our relationship grew slowly and naturally through shared work and mutual respect. Brian helped me understand that romantic love could be based on compatibility and shared values rather than financial necessity or family expectations. He'd grown up in a stable, loving household where conflict was resolved through communication rather than manipulation, and his emotional health helped me recognize how dysfunctional my family dynamics had always been. "April," he said one evening as we planned a summer reading camp for struggling students, "you've created something amazing with this foundation. Your father would be proud of how you've honored his memory while staying true to your own values." The comment reminded me of a letter Dad had written to Aunt Helen, but never sent one I discovered in his desk months after his death. In it, he'd outlined his vision for using his wealth to support education and community development dreams that aligned perfectly with the foundation I'd created. "I've been thinking about legacy," Dad's letter read. "Buildings crumble and businesses fail, but education changes lives for generations. If I could use my money to help teachers like April make a difference in children's lives, that would be worth more than any construction project I've ever completed." Reading his private thoughts had confirmed that the foundation represented not just my own values, but also Dad's evolving understanding of what mattered most in life. The relationship with Aunt Helen had deepened significantly during the foundation's development. She'd moved into the mansion's guest suite, claiming she wanted to help with administrative work, but really providing the family connection I'd been missing my entire life. Her stories about Mom and her honest assessments of Dad's strengths and weaknesses helped me understand our family history with compassion rather than resentment. Uncle Paul visited monthly from Akron, bringing practical advice about managing the foundation's finances and sharing memories of Dad that revealed his capacity for growth and change. Cousin Jessica had become one of our most effective volunteers, using her nursing background to develop health education programs that we offered to families in the community. The foundation's success had attracted attention from other philanthropic organizations and educational institutions. The Ohio Department of Education featured our scholarship program in their newsletter, and several universities had reached out about partnering on teacher preparation initiatives. But the most meaningful recognition came from unexpected sources, former students who'd heard about the foundation and wanted to share how my teaching had influenced their lives. Letters arrived regularly from children I'd taught years earlier, now in high school or college, describing how the confidence and skills they'd gained in my classroom had shaped their academic success. "Miss Thompson," wrote Marcus Williams, now a junior at Ohio State, "I still have the book you gave me in 3rd grade when I was struggling with reading. You wrote, 'Every great reader started with one book on the inside cover.' I'm studying to become a teacher because I want to help other kids the way you helped me." These letters reminded me that true wealth came from investing in people rather than accumulating possessions or status symbols. The money Dad had left me was valuable because it allowed me to amplify the work I'd already been doing as a teacher, reaching more students and supporting more educators than I could have helped alone. The contrast with Carla's situation couldn't have been more dramatic. She was serving her sentence at a federal prison in Kentucky, reportedly working in the laundry facility and participating in counseling programs that prison officials described as minimally compliant. Derek had been released after 14 months, but was struggling to find employment due to his criminal record and the public notoriety of his fraud conviction. Madison had moved back to Cleveland with her son working as a waitress while dealing with the ongoing legal and financial consequences of her involvement in their criminal schemes. The fairy tale escape to Texas had become a nightmare of debt, single parenthood, and social isolation that served as a cautionary tale about the real costs of choosing greed over integrity. But as I prepared for the Foundation's first annual fundraising dinner, scheduled for the anniversary of Dad's death, I realized that their stories had become irrelevant to my own happiness and success. I'd learned to measure my life by positive impact rather than by comparison to others' failures or successes. The foundation dinner would be held in the mansion's renovated dining room, where local teachers, community leaders, and scholarship recipients would celebrate the progress we'd made in supporting education. The menu featured comfort foods that reflected Mom's cooking and Dad's simple tastes, served on everyday dishes rather than the formal china that had made childhood meals feel like performances. As I stood in the kitchen where Mom had taught me to bake cookies and Dad had occasionally surprised us with weekend pancakes, I felt a sense of peace that had eluded me throughout my childhood and early adulthood. The house was filled with laughter and purpose, rather than tension and conflict. The money was being used to help others rather than to maintain superficial status or fund destructive behaviors. Most importantly, I'd learned to define success by my own values rather than by family expectations or social pressures. The family mistake had become someone who made a difference in her community, and the inheritance that was supposed to corrupt had instead become a tool for positive change. But there was still one more conversation I needed to have, one that would complete my journey from bitter family dynamics to genuine forgiveness and emotional freedom. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, exactly 1 year after Dad's death, delivered in the foundation office by a postal worker who seemed surprised to be delivering mail from a federal correctional institution. Carla's handwriting on the envelope was smaller and less confident than I remembered, but unmistakably hers. April. The letter began, "I don't expect you to read this, and I don't expect forgiveness, but I need to write these words even if you tear up this letter without finishing it." I sat in Dad's former office surrounded by scholarship applications and teaching resource catalogs, holding 3 pages of what appeared to be genuine introspection from the sister who'd tormented me for decades. "I've been in counseling here for 8 months, and Dr. Patricia Miller has helped me understand some things about myself that I never wanted to face," Carla continued. "I spent my entire life believing that success meant other people had to fail, that love was something you had to compete for, and that money was more important than relationships." The letter described Carla's daily routine in federal prison, working in the kitchen from 6 to 2, attending mandatory counseling sessions, and spending evenings in educational programs designed to help inmates develop employable skills and emotional intelligence. "I know this will sound self-serving," she wrote, "but I think I became the person who hurt you because I was afraid of being abandoned, like our father was abandoned by Patricia. I thought if I could just be successful enough, smart enough, ambitious enough, then people wouldn't leave me." Reading about Carla's fear of abandonment helped me understand the desperation that had driven her increasingly destructive behavior. The sister who'd seemed so confident and self-assured had actually been operating from a place of deep insecurity and terror of being unloved. "Dr. Miller helped me see that I turned you into a competitor instead of recognizing you as someone who could have been my ally and friend," the letter continued. "Every time Dad praised your kindness or your teaching, I felt threatened instead of proud. I made you my enemy when you were never anything but loving toward our family." The acknowledgement of my genuine love and kindness felt like a gift I'd waited 30 years to receive. Carla had finally recognized that my devotion to Dad during his illness had been authentic rather than manipulative, that my choice to become a teacher represented genuine values rather than lack of ambition. "I know what I did to you was unforgivable," she wrote. "I tried to destroy your reputation, your career, and your peace of mind because I couldn't accept that Dad had chosen correctly when he left everything to you. You deserve that inheritance not because you manipulated him, but because you embodied everything he came to value, most compassion, integrity, and service to others." The letter included specific apologies for each cruel act: the public humiliation at my school, the social media harassment, the attempts to undermine my teaching career, and the systematic theft of Dad's money that should have been part of my inheritance. "I stole over $300,000 from Dad and from the people whose identities I used for credit fraud," Carla acknowledged. "That money could have funded your foundation's programs for years, could have helped dozens more teachers and students than I destroyed through my greed and selfishness." But the most powerful part of the letter was Carla's description of learning about the Foundation's work through news articles other inmates had shared with her. "Someone showed me the newspaper story about your scholarship program, and I cried for 2 hours reading about the teachers you're helping and the students who'll benefit from their education," she wrote. "You took the money I tried to steal and used it to make the world better. You proved that Dad was right to trust you with his legacy." The letter concluded with a request that surprised me with its humility and genuine concern for my well-being. "I don't want you to visit me or write back unless you genuinely want to," Carla wrote. "I don't want forgiveness because I think I deserve it. I know I don't. But if you can find peace by forgiving me, then I hope you will, because you deserve to be free from the anger I caused through my choices." After reading the letter twice, I called Brian to discuss whether visiting Carla would be healing or harmful for my own emotional development. His response reflected the wisdom and balance that had drawn me to him from the beginning. "April, the question isn't whether Carla deserves forgiveness. It's whether you want to be free from carrying resentment," he said. "Forgiveness isn't about excusing her behavior or restoring a relationship. It's about releasing yourself from the burden of her choices." 2 weeks later, I drove to the Federal Correctional Institution in Lexington, Kentucky, for a conversation that would determine whether our family's story would end in permanent bitterness or eventual healing. The prison was less intimidating than I'd expected, more like a college campus surrounded by fencing than the fortress-like structure I'd imagined. Carla appeared in the visiting room wearing standard prison clothing that made her look smaller and more vulnerable than I'd ever seen her. Her expensive haircuts and designer clothes had been replaced by simple practicality, and her face showed signs of genuine introspection rather than the calculating expression I remembered. "April," she said quietly as I sat across from her at a small table. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure I would either," I admitted. "But I needed to see for myself whether your letter represented real change or another manipulation." The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours and covered 30 years of family dysfunction, with honesty that would have been impossible when we were children competing for Dad's attention. Carla described the counseling process that had helped her recognize her destructive patterns and accept responsibility for choices she'd previously blamed on others. "Dr. Miller made me write letters to every person I'd hurt, including all the identity theft victims," Carla explained. "I had to acknowledge specifically what I'd done and how it had affected their lives. Writing those letters showed me that I'd become a person who destroyed other people's security and happiness for my own convenience." She shared details about the restitution payments she was making to victims using her prison wages and any future earnings to repay what she'd stolen. The financial obligations would follow her for decades, ensuring that she'd spend years making amends for her criminal behavior. "I'll be 47 when I'm released," she said. "I'll have no money, no career prospects, and a criminal record that will make finding employment difficult. But I also won't have the constant fear and anger that drove me to hurt people for so many years." The woman sitting across from me bore little resemblance to the sister who'd called me the family mistake and tried to steal my inheritance. This Carla spoke quietly, maintained eye contact, and seemed genuinely interested in my well-being rather than plotting ways to benefit herself. "Tell me about the foundation," she said. "I read everything I could find online, but I want to hear about it from you." I described the scholarship programs, the teacher support initiatives, and the affordable housing projects that were creating opportunities for educators and students throughout Ohio. As I spoke, Carla's expression showed what appeared to be genuine pride in my accomplishments. "You did exactly what Dad hoped someone would do with his money," she said. "He always said that education was the best investment a community could make in its future. You proved him right." The conversation concluded with an understanding that felt both final and peaceful. Carla would serve her sentence work to repay her victims and rebuild her life without expecting support or forgiveness from me. I would continue the foundation's work without carrying resentment or anger toward her. "I hope you'll be happy, April," she said as our visiting time ended. I hope you'll find love with someone who appreciates your goodness, and I hope the foundation will help hundreds of teachers and thousands of students over the years. 6 months later, I stood before a crowd of educators, community leaders, and scholarship recipients at the Foundation's second annual fundraising dinner. The event had grown from our modest first gathering to a celebration that raised over $100,000 for educational programs. Brian sat at the head table wearing the suit he'd bought for the occasion and looking uncomfortable with the formal setting, but proud of the work we were accomplishing together. Aunt Helen moved through the crowd with the confidence of someone who'd helped organize dozens of community events, making sure donors felt appreciated and scholarship recipients felt celebrated. In my remarks to the audience, I shared the lesson that had emerged from 3 years of family conflict, personal growth, and community service. True wealth. I said looking out at faces of people who dedicated their lives to helping others isn't measured by what you accumulate for yourself, but by what you contribute to other people's success and happiness. I described how the foundation had grown from a personal inheritance into a community resource that would continue supporting education long after any individual's involvement ended. We've learned that forgiveness doesn't mean accepting abuse or excusing harmful behavior, I continued. It means refusing to carry other people's hatred in our own hearts. It means choosing to build rather than destroy, to heal rather than harm. The evening concluded with scholarship presentations to 12 students who'd committed to becoming teachers in high-need schools. As I watched these young people accept funding that would change their lives and their future students' lives, I realized that Dad's money had accomplished exactly what he'd hoped. It was creating opportunities for people who would dedicate their careers to helping others. After the guests departed and the cleanup was complete, Brian and I sat in the mansion's living room, surrounded by thank you cards from scholarship recipients and planning documents for next year's programs. "Your father would be amazed by what you've built," Brian said, reviewing the Foundation's annual report. "He left you money, but you've created something that will help people for generations." As we prepared for bed in the house where I'd spent my childhood feeling overlooked and undervalued, I reflected on the question that had driven me to visit Carla in prison, whether our family's story would end in bitterness or healing. The answer had become clear through the Foundation's success and the peace I'd found in forgiveness. Family isn't defined by blood relations or shared genetics. It's created by people who choose to support and celebrate each other's growth and happiness. The real family I'd built included Brian's love and partnership, Aunt Helen's wisdom and support, Uncle Paul's practical guidance, the teachers and students who participated in our programs, and the community of people who shared our commitment to education and service. Carla remained my sister by birth, but she was no longer my enemy by choice. She was someone who'd made destructive decisions and was working to rebuild her life more positively. Her journey toward redemption was separate from my journey toward purpose and happiness. The Foundation would continue growing, supporting more teachers and students each year, proving that resources used with wisdom and compassion create opportunities that multiply far beyond their original value. And as I turned off the lights in the house that had witnessed so much family pain and transformation, I knew that the best inheritance Dad had given me wasn't the money or property. It was the opportunity to discover that true success comes from using whatever advantages you have to help others achieve their own dreams. Have you ever experienced a family situation where you had to choose between holding on to resentment or choosing forgiveness for your own peace of mind? How do you think money and inheritance affect family relationships, especially when there are long-standing issues between siblings? I'd love to hear your thoughts about how families can heal from years of conflict and dysfunction. If this story resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to support more storytelling content, and share your own experiences in the comments below. Sometimes the most painful family situations can become opportunities for the greatest personal growth and positive change. Thank you for joining me on this journey through betrayal, justice, and ultimately redemption. Remember that your worth isn't determined by family approval or financial inheritance. It's defined by the kindness you show others and the positive impact you make in the world.